Good morning, everybody. My name is Craig Stockwell. I teach here at DigiPen. I'm also the director of the Game Design Academy and a board game designer myself. Today, we're going to have both Rob Heinsoo from Fire Opal and many other credits to his name. That's just his current venture and venue. And Jaym Gates, who's right now with Green Ronin, talking about the intersection of design and development. What do designers do? What do developers do, and how they can hopefully not run over each other's toes and work together harmoniously?
Yes.
Is that fair?
That's good enough. Well, we can fill it in a minute.
Oh, good. I'm glad I can give your entire talk for you.
Yeah, that's good.
If you were here yesterday, you know that at the end we will have raffle tickets because we have a number of considerate sponsors who provided us game design related gifts or prizes to give away, including Green Ronin. So please, if you're around, make sure you get a raffle ticket on your way out. And then in the other room, Van Gogh at 4 o'clock. You must be present to win, but show up there. We'll draw some names, and considering the number of people and the number of prizes, you have a much better chance of winning this than the lottery, I think.
That's good. Thank you.
Please
thank
proceed.
You,
okay.
And thank you.
We also have these fancy signs for you too, so you know when you're getting close to.
Oh, good, and they're colored.
And they look like soccer red cards and yellow cards, so
yes.
we know we're. I think we're going to ask a couple questions of you guys, but first we're going to go ahead and just frame what we're talking about today. This talk specifically is the words designer and developer have the bright side that they're really applicable in a lot of different ways, and the downside that they mean many different things in many different cases. So what we're specifically talking about right now is that game designers, when you're doing game design, it's frequently the initial creation of a system or an idea, or sometimes a card set. And development is more people who help make that actually as fun as it should be, as playable as it should be, and as balanced as it should be. They are oftentimes two different skill sets, although not all companies and not all processes treat them that way. And specifically, a place like Wizards of the Coast, for example, frequently really has the idea that, yeah, there are some people who are designers and some people who are developers. Elsewhere, for instance, in the tabletop game industry, you won't find it very much, and it just sort of happens ad hoc, or the editor is expected to develop, even though no one told the editor that. So, yeah, I think James can speak to that. Yep. So, what we're specifically going to be talking about today is that intersection between the designer and developer, and specifically a little bit more from the developer standpoint. Now, since we're doing the talk, it's important to know who you guys are. We may not be able to change everything we're going to say, but we can at least slant it towards what you're interested in. So how many of you in that would say you're more on the designer side than the developer side? And how? Okay, that's me. And and more on the developer side. Okay, all right, good. So we're sort of split. And then one. Okay, all right. And are any of you students at DigiPen? Okay. And the rest of you, are you working game designers now? Okay, excellent. And are you all tabletop game players? Okay. Oh, all right. Good. All right. Excellent. You're a blank slate that we can all right. Okay.
And I do have some video game experience that'll be coming in. So.
Okay. Good. Excellent. And how many of you have worked in video games as well? So. Okay. All right. So we're more tabletop. Okay. Perfect. Which is good because that's what this talk is supposed to be about. Excellent. The first part of the talk, I think, is phrased in a funny way. There's a term a friend told me called high-class problems, low-class problems. High-class problems are the problems you want to have, and this first section is sort of about high-class problems of working with really good designers as a developer. And low-class problems are you can't pay the rent. High-class problem, when you're working with designers, the number one problem with working with really good designers, in my experience, and I'll just say that, is essentially arrogance. If you are the developer, you will find that the designers have a natural tendency to believe that what they've done is really flippin' good. And if the designer actually is a really skilled designer, that problem is intensified simply because in their past life they've been right. And they have been right more often than not. They've done good work, and they don't really want to have it changed. Sometimes it can be utterly unconscious in the sense that they'll say the right things, like a friend who says, "Yes, I just want to do what's best here," and, but they're not really. They don't really mean it. And other times it's very, very deliberate and conscious. They do not want to have that change. The trick as a developer to get past this is, I don't know. I know 3 things, and Jaym, maybe you can say more. Go ahead, start.
So I actually think that there's, besides just the arrogance, there's another problem with really good developers or designers who are either not as experienced or not as confident. You also run into a need to constantly improve, and there comes a point where you can't improve things more without breaking them. And so something that I've run into a fair amount, I also work in publishing, so I work on novels, and this is a problem we see a lot there too, is that you'll have something come in that's actually really good, and you go, okay, this is good, let's go. And the person has so set themselves up for, this is a bad thing, I'm going to need a lot of fixing on this, that then they're just sitting there going, well, what if we do this, what if we do this? And you're sitting there basically like slapping their hand away from their project going, no, it's good, leave it alone. Just no, stop.
So in other words, what we're talking about is 2 sides of the curve.
Yes.
I started off with talking about like designers who are pretty experienced, who
Yes.
really have, and their high-class problem is a little bit more arrogance. You're talking about people who are really, really eager and who want more help than perhaps they need if they're
Yes.
actually really good.
Yeah, and they are very much flip sides of the problem. With the arrogant ones,
Okay.
what I find a lot of the time is that even if you're really, really good, you always have some blind spot. And not everyone will catch that. So a lot of the time, you'll get someone who is very good but arrogant, but they'll have had this one spot that no one's ever called out before. That's a real weakness, whether that's a balance in a magic system, whether that's a plot point, whether that's an adventure that doesn't have a satisfying ending. And because they've never really been called out on that by someone who's stuck to their guns, maybe someone went, oh, well, I think that this could be different versus you need to change this. Sometimes there's just that complete blindness to their own thing that once you finally argue them to a standstill, they go, oh, right, I do need to fix that. But you can end up with these ingrained patterns where they actually do believe that it's good because no one's ever called them on it.
Okay.
So that's...
And so unfortunately, the real answer to what the solution is turns out to be social skills.
Yes.
Bizarrely, the communication between the designer and the developer, when James says argue to a standstill, that is frequently how it goes. There should be a sort of a rubric of like how much more fun is the game, but that takes a while to show up in many designers' heads compared to their original desire not to have it change. And so in a certain way, I've compared this sometimes to relationships. I've seen many of my acquaintances be in a relationship with somebody who is telling them the truth about how they need to change. They never will change. They finally break up. The next thing you know, that person has changed completely to be what the advice was, but they couldn't do it while they were still in the relationship. Well, strangely enough, with designers and developers, that actually ends up happening on projects in a weird way, where the designer, doesn't necessarily learn the lesson on this game, and then the next time they're like, oh, no, they will never make that mistake again, but they're not necessarily going to thank the developer.
And then the previous developer is just saying that.
And the developers think, well, okay, I don't know, but the developer, if they're conscious, is going, I think I taught them something, but I'm not sure I'm going to get credit for it. And that's a strange relationship thing with really, really skilled designers, I would say. I think that the opposite of what you said in terms of like a product that doesn't need help, occasionally we run into the problem of what I call false polish. When designers are really skilled, and especially in tabletop role-playing writing, I would say, you can frequently look at a product and you think, oh my God, it's so well written, it's got so many interesting ideas, this is just going to work. And it's good, it's just going to work. And then when you start digging into it, you find that polish was a false lead. It is not actually as, the truth is it doesn't work. The mechanics underneath it don't work, or the story doesn't really function. And therefore, this is a problem you will find with really actually skilled designers. And I think we're going to get to just by saying it, we're going to get to the low-class problems of working with not skilled designers. But right now we're starting with a high-class situation that I hope you all have, working with really talented people. False polish, in my experience, I've had this happen all the time on tabletop, and I've actually been the designer who did it myself. I mean, I think I did a miniatures game once where the development team thought it looked really flippin' good, and and was really excited by it, and then they didn't realize just how deep some of the flaws were until it was a little too late, and and at that point they were too far advanced. And so the weird part about it is what this says is, in my experience, proper assessment very early on, like truly understanding milestones, truly going ahead and like playing early versions more than, you can't accept a quick glance at something. And now this becomes tough in the industry because frequently people are juggling 5 or 6 products. And the triage, when the terrible, terrible product comes over the transom, that needs fixing.
But you don't have very long to deal with it.
And you don't have long to deal with it. And then the good one, you're like, oh man, I think that's great. And then you find out at the moment you're trying to send it, to really finish it, you're like, oh, it's not as good as you thought it was. So that's the false polish problem.
Yeah, and I think that one of the skills that is really undersold in gaming is a really critical mindset. And I don't mean this in a nagging sort of way, but in the way where you understand how things work. And it doesn't need to be an understanding of every single element of the process from conception to, tail marketing. Having an understanding, like for me, my strength is in developmental editing. I can look at an idea and I can say, here are the weak points, here's where we can build it up stronger, here's how we can make this function. Having that critical understanding allows me to look at a game and say, here are the weak points here, but I have to be careful as a developer to not think too much of I trust this really great designer, because you can be super blind to your own flaws. I'm also a writer, and I know that I cannot edit my own work. I cannot do developmental editing on my own work because I'm blind to the flaws and have been working on it for so long that I'm blind to very large flaws. My partner is a board game designer. His strength is in rules. He doesn't have a single graphic design bone in his body, but he can look at a board game and he can deconstruct the rules in 5 minutes, and he can build a new rule system from scratch in a couple of hours. That's his skill. Right. And so he can look at a game and say, here are the issues with this. It's why he's a great playtester. I can look at it and say, from a narrative point of view, this doesn't make sense, and from an interaction point of view, this doesn't work. I'm useless on rules. So if you are a developer, having an understanding of an area or two is really good, but to do that, you need to have an understanding of things other than what you're working on. And what I find a lot of people doing is kind of thinking, okay, this one game is going to take all of my focus. And so you get into this blind spot where you've been working on certain games so long that when you get that false polished game in, you're looking at it in the context only of the games you've been working on a lot of the time. And so you end up having no reference, you haven't been playing other games that have been coming out, you haven't been reading other books that have been coming out, and so you don't see the flaws in that until it's too late, and then maybe you play something else and you go, oh my god, how did I miss this in my own game? Right. So not developing tunnel vision will help you understand those false polish games coming in because you'll have outside perspective, but also having a critic's mindset as a developer is really, really important.
There's another category that I just call great mechanics, wrong game. This is a happy situation because if you actually have a good relationship with the designer, you can essentially be telling them, yes, this is clever. Yes, this does something wonderful. We should find another game for it, and a lot of times, I mean, this happens a lot actually in the gaming industry, where the truth is, because having a clever mechanic, frequently designers are satisfied with, I have a clever mechanic, I have an elegant mechanic. I think that's enough. And that isn't true precisely. It's also better, you know, sometimes that either it's not right for what the market strategy is for the game, or it's not right for the setting and the story of the game. Both those situations, I've seen games just the game mechanics be completely rephrased for other products, and that is something that developers frequently have to help with. When it works, the designers are very happy. As you probably know, there are designers like Rainer Knizia who doesn't touch the story of his things at all. He is a math person. And consequently, what will happen is that some of Reiner's games feel pretty accurate in terms of like, oh, that's right, it's a story I enjoy. And other times it's like, I don't think this is a, you know, whatever this math exercise is, it doesn't really feel connected to the story. And, you know, from my perspective, the developer should have helped him out more there, because we know that's not what he does. So come on, developers, do a little better there. But so therefore, when Reiner nails one, you're like, oh, thank you, developers. You know, that's good. It all came together. That is much more. Oftentimes, designers take care of that themselves, but sometimes they don't. And like I said, that's a high-class problem.
So there's an interesting correlation there. Green Ronin does a fair number of licensed properties. So we have an interesting thing in our pitch phase where when we're bringing in new licenses, we have to try and figure out what setting or what system will work for that property. And it can be very interesting because sometimes one of our systems, like the age system, will just slot right into something. Other times, there's not really anything that works right, but it's not enough to have to design an entirely new system, at which point we have to put in the time to say, okay, we're adapting, you know, D20 or age or whatever the case is to work for this system. And then there are times where it's like, we're just going to have to design a new
thing.
Setting a new system from the beginning, from the ground up, because nothing that we have is going to work for that. And sometimes we get a little into the process before we figure out it's going to need a lot more adjustment than we thought.
Right.
So that's always an interesting thing when you're working with licensed properties, of finding what will be really good for the license, what will also work for you, and what will work for the player. So
I will ask you questions specifically about that later. That's good. There's one more problem that I would describe as a problem with high-class problem with good designers. And the thing is, this is a problem throughout the entire industry, but it has a weird wrinkle. Some designers are not fast. The strange thing that happens with really good designers is that they are given more rope, because everyone knows that it's advantageous to get their design work, and therefore they get a little more time, perhaps, than people who aren't trusted as much. This probably makes sense, and I'm speaking as a person who is on the side of being given more time. But simultaneously, as developers, you are the person who feels the crunch. Like, it is always the developers and always the editors whose time is valued less and compressed at the end of the project. And what that tends to mean is that as a designer, you have to be aware if you're late, you're hurting the rest of the team more than you're hurting yourself, bizarrely. And so there's almost a civic responsibility. For developers, there's the fact that when designers are slow and late, one of the best things you can actually, in a weird sense, possibly do for them is start the development process early.
Yeah.
You don't wait for them to be completely done with it. You start working with them and talking with them about what it is they want. Because the key thing with designers is frequently that they do have a vision of what they want the rules to accomplish, but actually playing it, you'll find that it's not quite accomplishing that. And so if that conversation starts earlier, before the designer is completely done with whatever they consider their turnover, it can be helpful. This obviously doesn't work when the designer is like alone or with their team and making up something that they're going to give to a company or sell to a company. It can work much better when design and development teams are part of the same, connected from the very beginning and understand they're going to be working together. sometimes when, go ahead, Jaym, do you have anything to add to that? Because
I do
just gonna
actually.
skip ahead.
The good thing about work, if you have someone who runs behind, especially if you've worked with them before and you know that they're likely to be really close or over the deadline, is if you're working on it ahead of time and you figure out that it's just not working, it gives you more time to say, hey, we need to start this over. If you get a late turnover on something and it doesn't work, your schedule is completely out of whack. And that's less stressful when you are a team who will be trying to sell this to a company. Mm-hmm. But if you're working to a schedule where, so like for Green Ronin, we have to solicit these titles months in advance for our distribution. We don't get to say, oh, hey guys, you know, it's a week until we were supposed to release this, but we're not going to have it for another 3 months. Sometimes that's inevitable and we have to, but as a general rule, if we start doing that, it really starts cutting into who will order our products and into the customer confidence. So weighing in early and saying, okay, this isn't working, we need to start over, we need to have a serious, hardcore playtest, drill into this, figure out what's going on. The other thing is if you can see that it's very clear that the designer is just not going to work, especially with a new designer, because going back to what I had said earlier, sometimes you have very, very good designers with crippling self-doubt. And so you can run into an issue where you have a really good product, it's just never going to get finished. And I've seen that a number of times where it's like, you have a really great thing here. No, I can't do it, I can't finish it. I've had so many projects, especially on my editing side, where it's like, this is really amazing, and just halfway through, their confidence just fails. Well, unfortunately, that usually fails about 2 hours before the deadline. At that point, I'm often kind of screwed, to the point where I have learned to build in at least a couple of extra weeks. Now, what can be really useful there is when you have a designer who, they may not be the best person ever, but they're very fast and they're very reliable. And they can come in and they can just go ahead and build that, and then you can make it better in development. But having that relationship, and this goes back to the communication, having that relationship with your designer and developer team is really, really important, because it means that you can get in ahead of time and head a lot of those off at the pass and not at the 11th hour just suddenly go, this is due to the printers in a week and we have nothing.
So I have since I really haven't experienced what you're talking about, I have barely at all. My question on that one is this a situation when in that situation, when there are milestones that are early milestones, do things fall apart in their early milestones, or do they only fall apart? Are they falling apart at the end?
Frequently at the end. What I've had happen, so the clearest way for me to...
So it's the finishing thing.
Yeah, to demonstrate this is actually through fiction, because I do a lot of fiction editing. Usually when I'm doing tie-in fiction, like I do Nasaba Press for Green Ronin, I ask for some pitches, and then for a sample, and then for the full story. Pitches are easy. Samples are fairly easy. The full story, on the other hand, can be the really, really scary thing, especially if you're starting to look at a novel. And so I'll have people who get 75% of the way through the project, or who get 100% of the way through the project, and then go, I can't turn this in, this is awful, I need to rewrite it from the start. And it's like, you have a week to write a novel, I need to be looking for someone else.
Okay.
So, yeah, a lot of it is at that finishing, because it's great, and then sticking the landing, just everything just kind of goes.
Different pieces of the industry, because I have barely experienced this. I totally understand you have.
I will admit that I have actually done this, but fortunately I'm fairly good at saying early on, I don't have...
Right.
There was, so throwing myself into the bus here, there was an adventure that I was contracted to write for a company, and it was... I was not working well with the developer because there was not enough strong guidance. It was the first adventure I'd ever written, and I was having issues with the setting because I'm a little too historical nerd, so I need things to make sense, and it wasn't. And I had done about 50% of the project, and I just said, this is not working, you need to fire me and find someone else.
Right.
And I had to argue with the developer to fire me because he really, really wanted to make it work. And I'm like, no, I don't have the skill necessary to finish this. So as a developer, you need to have that ability to make that hard call and say, this isn't working for either of us.
Yeah.
We're done.
That's good you did it. In my experience lately, I have been in the same boat of finding out if the people actually really want to do the project and using milestones like small, tiny ones.
Yes.
Tiny milestones saying, here's an example. All I need is 1,000 words, and then if you don't enjoy the 1,000 words, we'll do something else, and that's fine. I think this segues easily into what I would call the lower class problems of working with bad designers. If you're a developer and other people's mistakes drive you crazy, don't be a developer. I'm sorry, but the truth is, for instance, I shouldn't work as a developer. I got into the gaming industry sort of as a developer, doing early card games, Shadow Fist, On the Edge, things like that, and then designing them. But honestly, other people's mistakes irritate me too much. I'm not good as an editor/developer. I do it all the time, but it shouldn't be me. I'm fully aware of this, and the companies I work with overall, are like, please, we'd like to use you as a designer. I'm like, yes,
And also a developer.
Nah, it just happens. So, but it's a key thing. I think, I'm going to turn. Who here is really an editor/developer? Really enjoys that. Okay, do you guys get irritated by the people's mistakes, or is it all right for you? You don't. Good.
I love fixing things.
I like to find out why the mistakes exist.
Yeah.
Because in my opinion, the thing that a developer can do best is ask interesting questions of the designer.
Sure.
To lead them to the answer. When personal experience, when you say, why'd you put this mechanic in? Because it's not good, but I want to fix the problem you were trying to fix. Then you should, at the end of that, both be at the same page of, that's a better fix for the problem than what I duct taped in halfway through because I was in a hurry.
Right.
The other way that I look at it is, what were you trying to say here?
Yep.
What was your intention? Okay, that wasn't expressed well. Here's how we can express it better. I work with a lot of newbies, again, especially on the fiction side, because one of my big things is about bringing more diverse voices into gaming and into fiction. And so I specifically reach out to a lot of younger folks who have not really had any sort of gateway into the industry. And so frequently I find myself working with someone that they just have never done that. They hit a snag and they don't know how to get over that hurdle. And so when I do my notes, I will say, here's what I think you're trying to say, or this doesn't make sense. Can you explain what you're doing here? And so we'll do a couple of back and forths, and then it's like, they'll say, okay, this is what I was trying to do. All right, here's how we make this happen. I had a story a while back where the author was a veteran, and it was a military science fiction thing, and I did all the edits, sent it back to them, and I got an email in reply saying, can I call you and talk to you because I cannot divorce myself from my experiences to feel like to adjust these as edits because it feels like my experiences are being called into question. So I called them, I talked to them, it was very cathartic for them, but we worked through it, and there was a lot of, okay, so here's what you were trying to convey, but it's too close to you. Here's how we pull it back to make it serve the story best. And you get that a lot in game design too, because it is very personal. So being able to say, all right, this is your experience. Here's how we make it a really good mechanic. Here's how we make it a really good plot theme. Let me help you interpret it. So as an editor and developer, as a general rule, I don't come in with, I want my voice to be heard. And on game development, a little more than on straight editing. On straight editing, I am making your voice shine. And I like that because for me, it's a challenge to put myself into someone else's headspace and kind of chameleon into their voice.
I like the combination of what you two are saying. What's your name, by the way? I should know.
I'm Will. Scoot over.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Good. I think that I recognize when I say I'm irritated by mistakes. The thing that is most problematic is only when there aren't enough good ideas to finish the work, because mistakes happen all the time. The low-class problem when designers don't know what they're doing is that there just won't be enough good ideas to actually flesh out. There is the question of intention of what are they actually trying to do. It's like, well, it isn't quite there. Now that is unfortunately the worst problem for developers.
And a very common one.
and it turns into what we call designament, where, okay, technically you're the developer, but now you have a decision to make. It looks like the designer isn't, maybe the designer isn't capable of supplying it. In the conversation we'll find out. And if that's the case, then there's another process that happens where the developers actually end up helping design. Now, ideally that doesn't happen very often, but it does, and that is the worst problem perhaps, because the higher grade of it is, oh, they've got great ideas, and their intentions are good, and you just have to make those work. Which
or they have too many ideas, and we have to choose which ones to use. Which, oh God, that's a wonderful problem to have.
And so let's talk about that for 1 second. In most pieces of the industry, the truth is designers do more ideas than can be actually fully expressed in a final product. That's usually what happens. And so development usually is paring things away and focusing to what the real core is. That's usually true. It isn't always true, though.
It isn't always true, no. One of the things to be careful of is just because it's a cool idea doesn't mean it needs to be used. There's a phrase that I think is only in publishing. My things cross over enough, I'm not sure, but kill your darlings. If there's a thing that you are just contorting yourself to try and keep in and it doesn't actually make logical sense, cut it out and see what happens, because the chances are really good that it will make your game a lot better. If you have this really, and this goes back to your good mechanics, wrong game, this idea might be great, but maybe not for this game. I will often end up cutting out something that I've developed. I just did some development for a friend, and he needed me to flesh out a certain section of his stuff, and I got all into it. I developed this amazing thing, and then realized I should probably Google and make sure that it wasn't a real thing. It was a real thing. I now have 300 words of this great design idea sitting off somewhere else because it wasn't right for that game. So, having the ability to pare down and choose what does and doesn't survive is definitely something you need to be able to do.
I think there is another problem with high-class designers that I forgot to mention. It's not arrogance, it's perversity.
Yes.
And the things we're talking about now, when you're saying kill your darlings, the communication piece, there are times where designers will leave things in a design that they know are wrong. They love it so much, and they're handing the problem off to someone else.
I can't kill
it, but I sure hope you can fix it, and just need some help. And, realistically, they know they should probably kill it. Or they're actually playing jokes. I mean, this is crazy, but I've actually had situations where designers have put things in as jokes, forgotten it, and just, walked away, and then, I've seen it happen at a party once where somebody said, I never figured out why you did such and such. And the designer's like, you left that in?
Exactly.
It's people going, oh, come on. And so, I mean...
See, if you're an evil developer, you see that, you recognize it, and then you make it part of the game that the designer has to deal with.
Okay, well... now we're getting jiu-jitsu. I can't even follow you. Yeah, the irony of me, the designer, giving this talk is okay, thank you. All right.
Developers are very perverse as well.
Yeah, now we're getting into the tangle. The solution, when I said simplification, oh God, you made me lose my train of thought. I'm thinking, Jaym, what game did you do that on?
I'm never telling.
All right, very good. All right. There are companies, and I don't think I'm going to name names at the moment, but bizarrely, depending on who you work for, especially if it involves a lot of plastic toys, the truth is some companies handle development completely differently. They take as many ideas as they possibly can, stuff them into the same box, sell it, and then they let the fans figure out which actually worked, and then they republish the box with slightly different minis, and huzzah, double the profits. Now, I don't really think that's the best way to go ahead and handle development. Simultaneously, if you can get away with it because you're in a particular part of the...
I thought you said we weren't naming names on this.
I am not. The part of the... There are pieces of the industry where what you're actually selling are toys. And when you're actually selling toys, there seems to be a very different relationship to what game design is and what development could be. And it may not matter as much. That's the bizarre thing.
Well, it's not really that bizarre, because when you look at something like a straight-up tabletop RPG, it has to work with what's there. Everything that you are doing in a
theater of the mind.
Straight up, it is theater of the mind. It is in one book, and yeah, you'll often have your minis or whatever, but the goal is that you can play with exactly what's in that book and a handful of dice. When you have the minis and the toys, that gives you a whole different outlet, because you already have a visual for it. You have a lot of things suggested just in the minis themselves, and there's a lot more visual bang for the buck, so it can distract from bad design or from bad development pretty easily.
Realistically, the strange thing is that the role-playing game equivalent of it has been that I think this is actually partially changing, partially as a consequence of indie gaming and just more people coming into gaming. But the truth is, solitaire gaming is what I call people, including me, buying walls of books that they never play but instead read.
Guilty.
And as a reading experience, the bizarre thing is, you know, the game mechanics don't have to work as well. And sometimes what happens is you read things and you realize, I don't think this works, but I do enjoy it for the art and I do enjoy it for the story, and you know, you keep it around. Ideally, that's not what we're talking about right now, but it is worth noting that that high standards of design and development usually apply, but sometimes in a weird sense the market says they don't. And I just mention it, I don't necessarily want to pursue it. So. Well,
actually a brief tangent that I think is somewhat useful is we're getting to the point where we have a really educated fan base, an educated core fan base. You have things like Critical Role that are bringing in brand new fans who this is really the first they've ever interacted. But as an industry, we have a really solid core base. So it is entirely feasible to put out a book that doesn't have any rules, that is entirely setting and fluff. And if you can't design and you don't like mechanics, that is a viable path. There are books I will back on Kickstarter because I don't care what the system is. I'm going to strip out the ideas and plaster them onto whatever system I feel like playing. Granted, I don't ever actually get to play, so I'm in Rob's solitary gaming thing, so, you know. But I think that is worth mentioning and worth being aware of, is that that is still viable. But anyways, back to the notes.
As a creator of story, do you like the word fluff?
I do, because I think that there's the core of the thing, and then I think that there's a lot of stuff that I really enjoy that isn't essential, but it does add to the experience. I can tell a really good story in 500 words, but it's going to be more enjoyable. It's going to give me more of an understanding of the world if I do it in 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, you know. And this is actually a challenge I set myself early on as a writer, was because plot has always been my problem. I'm too much in that, well, this could happen, this could happen. I like multiple open endings. Write a story in 500 words, and so you're stripping out the fluff and you have just the story. And it was a really, really good educational tool for me to use. Okay. Now that we're firmly far afield.
You are firmly far afield. I like that. You say that 5 times fast.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a quick look at my notes and find out if there's anything that I really wanted to talk about. We've almost talked about this, but I've seen this happen. Rules are frequently something that gets written at the end of a game. Like, people sort of play by teaching each other how to play, and I would advise that you change that. Don't let the designer walk away, go anywhere away from the project without actually writing down what they think the rules are, and not telling you, writing them down. And as and if you're the developer or the designer, keep on updating the rules. Have rules from the very beginning that are written, and keep them updated.
Have version control. Don't do all of your edits in one document, because there'll come a point where something breaks, and if you don't have any history to go back and look at when it was working, I hope you remember it.
That sounds painfully like a real problem. So okay, and this will save an awful lot of trouble, because there are projects where in order to write rules, the actual intent of the designer and what the plan is has to become coherent, and it helps immeasurably for someone else to have to understand them from the very beginning. Now, obviously, this happens when you start doing blind play testing and things like that, but I just advise do it from the very start. Even if you're not using a developer, do it from the very start. There's another thing about design and development, and that is just that as a rule, designers get most of the glory. This is cultural. It's the same thing for writers and editors.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, if you're choosing what you're going to do, there are a lot of people who just want the glory, and they therefore try to be designers. And sometimes it's like, it turns out, well, actually, they're much better developers, and so there's a weird mix there. Simultaneously, I've started trying more often, on role-playing game books. Like when I have a role-playing game book that's been done by a writer and a developer, and I'm like, I think the developer did an awful lot on this book. I'm putting their name on the cover. Yeah. I tend not to do that if it's myself, because that's a little bit sort of like, okay, now I'm taking your thing. But when it's like two people who are working for me, and they have both done incredible work, and the developer has actually made this thing, I'm going to put their name on the cover when I can, because I just don't feel like developers should always be hidden in a way. So this is, yeah.
Let me address something real fast.
And then we'll have room for questions.
There's actually somewhat of a perception sometimes that editors are a bit of second-class citizens and developers, because we're not doing the actual design of a project. We're not starting and coming up with all of the ideas. So clearly, we're not as skilled. We're just cleaning up other people's messes. And this is a discussion that has been had ad nauseum in the publishing world, and that I actually just spent 2 hours on Facebook the last couple of days arguing with a British designer about. That, editors, developers, proofreaders, the back end of a game is every bit as essential as the front end. And if you've ever played a first draft game from a designer, you will understand why developers and editors are important. With Green Ronin, we have typically our designers go from the design all the way through the development on whatever book they're doing, but they have at least half a dozen other people involved, and then they get an editing pass and a proofreading pass, and that's essential to good design. So if you are going in as a designer, make sure that you understand that editors are your friends, developers are your friends. We're not out there to ruin your project. There are developers and editors who are. There are some who are determined.
Okay.
Who are determined to put their stamp on a project, and who have an idea of what they want it to be, and they will make it theirs. I've had a story rewritten entirely by someone who meant very well and who changed it to what she wanted, not what I was writing. As an editor or developer going in, understand that your job is to make this project the best it can possibly be, in whatever form that is. Even if it's not something that you personally love, go with that. If it's something that you and the designer can't come to an agreement on because their idea you think is just permanently broken, maybe that's not the project to work on for you. So so have an idea of your worth as an editor or developer, and as a designer, trust your editor and developer to at least listen to them. You don't have to take everything they say, but you do need to listen with an open mind.
And so, speaking optimistically, what I would say coming out of that is that if in the industry we begin giving developers and editors more credit, the reality is I think the relationship between developers and designers gets better. I think realistically one of the things that happens right now is developers do end up feeling frequently that the only way they can make a stamp on things is to essentially become the designer, and that's better for your own projects later perhaps, rather than like taking over a project. So I think we definitely have time for questions, and I know there are some. Jaym, do you want to?
Yeah, so and we'll start with you, but just before we get started, One question at a time. If we have time for multiple questions from people, we'll loop back around, but go ahead and do one at a time for now. Also, if you could keep it as a question, not a comment, so that we can make sure to get to everyone. I know I'll be outside for a while after if people want to discuss something more, but for now, let's just keep them to questions. And if you specifically have a question for one of us, feel free to address it. Otherwise, we'll just address it as we best see fit. So.
And if you guys could repeat the question back.
Okay.
Good.
Sorry, I forgot that you guys take questions at the end.
No, you're fine.
Yeah. So, having not really a whole lot of knowledge in this sort of thing, so do design is that kind of a trend that developers don't get credited in the same place in the same way as designers?
So I'll phrase the question. Okay. So the question was, is it a trend that developers don't get credited in the same way or the same place as designers?
Definitely, depending on where you are, which I know is not a straight answer, but there are some places that are really good about crediting developers. There are some places where it's essentially an invisible job. Editing is almost entirely an invisible job. If you are editing a project, you might get your name in the front page credits if it's a good company that is very aware of that. In books, I don't have, there are a dozen books out there that I don't have any credits on, and it's my word that I worked on them. So gaming can be better about that than publishing. In video games, there's really, really a lot of invisibility for editors.
Well, I think that, and then cover credit. For instance,
Yes.
When you're talking about books and games, there's only room for, companies do not want to have a whole ton of names on covers. So the reality is that, and nearly always it's the designers that get the credit. When I was talking about putting a developer on occasionally, that does happen and it can happen, but it's more rarity for covers, and it usually has to be, and so, but credits inside inside in the small print, usually developers receive credit, nearly always, and editors usually. But for the book publishing, as you're saying, no, editors maybe not at all.
And for the cover, it's usually the name that will get the most pull or recognition. So, if it's a book that's been developed by Rob Heinsoo, but designed by someone who's never really done anything in the industry, publisher is probably going to lean towards putting Rob's name somewhere visible on the cover, versus if Rob's the designer and a new person is the developer, so.
I try to avoid that as a rule, but that's actually, since I'm not a developer, it doesn't come up as much.
Well,
right.
I figured I would use you rather than throwing some other person under the bus.
I think that what frequently happens, actually, when you think about it, it's like with Leonard Nimoy wrote a lot of novels at one time in his life. No, he didn't. And that stuff is far less common in gaming. I suspect there are, perhaps when you're Sid Meier, just the fact that you exist, and are involved somehow means that really it is Sid Meier's civilization, isn't it? I mean, it all is. Everything. Yeah. No, we're all in Sid Meier's civilization. So, at that stage, it's a totally different story, and So the thing about being at a time, yes, working in, also it really depends on the size of the company you work in. If you're working in a large company like Wizards of the Coast, for example, which is a Hasbro thing, there are many, many cases where people work and receive no credits at all because they're just part of giant teams. And then later on, when people apply for work, they're telling people, I really did work on that. It's kind of like, well. At
that point, Wizards of the Coast being on your resume is
the important part.
Yeah. So, and then you had a question?
Yeah. As somebody who's just beginning to explore the idea of game design, how do you design for development? In other words, how do I avoid developing bad habits that, that make development more challenging?
I can rephrase this and you answer it. So the question is, for a new designer coming in, how do you develop good design habits that don't make development's life more difficult?
Okay, so it's an excellent question. The first question is whether or not you have a developer set ahead of time. It's like if you know who you're going to be working with, then your communication with them is is important from the start, because they're going to be able to tell you some things. If you don't, as a new designer, frequently you don't have a developer set up. So then what you're doing is there's two ways to think about this. One is that in order to prove that your system works, you ideally are playing something. You're playing a game, you're having fun. However, there are certain types of games, like imagine games that have a very large card set. It is a mistake to go ahead and design 200 cards for your undeveloped and not necessarily entirely finished game, because when you play, you want to be playing with 200 cards. You may be wasting your time. Now you might. There's a way to look at it and say, as a design exercise, you may be learning something good. But the truth is that when the developer takes over, having that much more work that you've done that they are trying to sift through to figure out whether or not you had something may not be helping things. Even if you know the game is going to be played with dozens and dozens and dozens of pieces, you may not, if you're actually going to have a developer soon, you may not be wanting to flesh that out completely that way. I think James on the side is going to have a good answer for us.
You read my mind.
Yeah.
I'll add to that if you want to design for development, you should document your design goals as well as just the rules of the game. You can't expect the developers to infer what you want from what you've made, but rather write it down explicitly.
So repeat the answer.
Yeah. James said that it is also very important for the designer to document their goals, because you don't want the developer, this isn't a puzzle game, you don't want the developer to have to read it and archaeologically figure out, I think what they meant, it is this. And so this gets back to writing the rules from the very start and writing the guidelines. Was there anything I missed out of that? Okay. I actually have had this happen really recently with a project where, it's sort of a translation of a project, and when they told me what their philosophy was, I realized that part of the philosophy hadn't come through in the game design, that I was just able to be like, and it was really, really helpful for them to tell me the philosophy, because I was able to know, so when I make changes, you're going to be really happy because it's going to be more like that philosophy, but it isn't, but it's not, but I never would have known. I would not have known that was the philosophy. And so I think that ties together. I feel like your question is such a good question that there's actually probably 2 or 3 more really serious answers. And I think that one of the biggest ones is this. The reason that other people are interested in your games are to have fun. They're not interested because it's clever, and they're not interested because usually, And so if the people you play with and are having fun with something early on and are saying, oh, there's something here, and you can feel that, you're on the way. But sometimes what happens is that as designers, we like something just because it accomplishes a clever mechanic that no one else has ever done, but it turns out a while later you realize, oh, it's not fun enough yet.
There's a reason no one else has ever done it sometimes, too.
That's exactly right. Sometimes there's a reason. But when I say that, if you're thinking about making it fun for the developer, the developer needs to have fun too. And if they don't, they'll tell you pretty quickly. So I know there's better answers. And if anybody who wants our business cards can go ahead and email us, and we'll send them a version of this talk. And if we come up with a definite answer, I'll have it for you. Okay. Patrick, when you said we have 5 minutes, are we 5 minutes from our 25-minute question period?
Yeah, you still have. You have a 25-minute overtime.
Excellent. Overtime period. We are not.
And we were worried about not.
No, we're good. We're good. All right. are there any more questions that people have? And you can, if questions can range beyond this topic as well, because we are not in a class with one lecture topic.
So, gentleman in the back.
Judy?
I thought it was interesting what you were saying about games bringing more than just the game. As a tech person, I kind of think of it as being almost like the payload is the deliverable that people are getting when they pay for it. And if it happens to be toys, or it happens to be sticker books, or something like that, but those also bring some sort of intrinsic value. I was curious if you had more to elaborate on that, or if that gives you like a different way of thinking about almost like cross genre type. I don't know.
Okay.
If there are examples of games that
sure.
fall into that category.
Okay, so JV's question is, he was interested when we talked about games that have toys and pieces and excellent art and things that make the experience of consuming them or looking at them pleasurable in itself rather than necessarily having to be played. And you were curious whether we had more to say about that and about the intrinsic value of, let's call them artifacts. I could say something.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that Kickstarter is definitely showing is that there is a market for exciting pieces and exciting artistic designs that have not been being necessarily done by standard gaming companies. You know, and essentially, I think that the whole distribution network takes a big chunk of money, and when people are being paid to do something they love more directly by the audience, people are going ahead and creating more labors of love, and some of those labors of love end up having production values and elements that probably gaming companies weren't going to get around to producing on their own for quite some time. And so that's one aspect that I find amusing and am cheered by. I also think that, you know, when you look at the question you're asking could be phrased to designers as saying, if you can create a game that uses wooden blocks in a way people have never used wooden blocks, and they're really wonderful, and people just like holding the wooden blocks. Well, we all grew up playing with wooden blocks as kids, and maybe people want to, you know, do that now as adults, and or maybe, you know, the transparent card technology hasn't necessarily been used as, you know, Keith Baker used it in Gloom, and Wizards of the Coast used it in Hecatomb, and I don't know if anyone remembered that second one, and you know, and there have probably been a couple others, but you know, reality is there are some artifact approaches that are probably still waiting to be like really exploited as much as they can. Toy box games make people happy just by having things to set around their life. And do you have a question? Hey, Paul, do you have a question on that?
Well, I have a question.
A different question. Okay. So let's let Jaym finish answering this one, and then we'll get you to the next question.
So publishing actually went through an interesting discussion about this a while back, because as Kickstarter started rising, we started having a lot of discussion about why people would buy a physical book, and also digital, as digital started gaining supremacy for a while. Why would people buy a physical book, especially if it's not by an author they already know and love? I got my start doing anthologies, and one of the things that I committed to doing very early on was anthologies as art pieces. I was part of a team including the amazing artist Lee Moyer, who does a lot of RPG work, with a book called Geek Love. And we made this book from top to bottom, beautifully designed, like even the layout of it. We had a layout artist who now works for Monte Cook. And I mean, there's a reason for it. He is one of the best guys in the business. But we did this beautiful art piece, and it sold really, really well. And so there are a lot of people in publishing who say that anthologies don't sell. Meanwhile, every single anthology I've taken to Kickstarter has funded well over its necessary goal. because I'm doing them as art pieces. And we're starting to see that more with RPGs too. I backed a Kickstarter recently that was these beautiful, basically art pieces as spells. And so they're just spell pages to use in your game. I don't DM enough to ever use them, but they are gorgeous. I bought them because I wanted to have them. And so I think we're also starting to hit another market of people who maybe won't actually game, but who are who enjoy the merchandise of gaming or the reading of the books of gaming. So if we keep that in mind and produce beautiful products that are also functional, I think that expands our market greatly. And as we're starting to understand the value of production and layout and design from the graphic side of things, I think we'll start seeing the market expand in that direction too.
And I think Jaym, you're reminding me of something. I think there have been actually some odd changes in, for instance, like role-playing gaming. Right now, I think Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is actually selling better than any other edition of the game sold. And the numbers, I think, indicate that a higher percentage of people buying it are playing it. And what was really interesting is that in the past, many past editions, there were an awful lot of people buying but not playing. So they were already buying as the art book style thing. And so in a weird way, different sectors of the industry go in different directions. And I think that the art anthology book you're talking about by Lee is definitely an example, very much like the ability to repackage familiar content in a way that makes people excited just to have it around them. Yes, that's a piece of, and the weird part about it is, the one question would be, well, how many game designers are really good at that? Or do they work with really talented graphic designers and artists and people who can bring that out? I think that there might be some game designers who are quite good at it, but really it's better working with other talented people. Yeah. So, you had a question over here.
Yeah. So my question is actually, it's a board game question, but it's a role-playing question. So I am thinking about building a board game where the crust of what the actual people need to do is role play more to get the game to work. And I was curious in development how to bring that up. If you have any tips of how to, because most people when they board game, it's just, I move my meatball in this wonderful direction, where the game will actually be enhanced if you actually play along, if you actually, in character, play along with what's going on.
All right. I'm going to repeat your question, and in the act, I'm going to ask more about what your question is. So it sounds like you're creating a board game, but in the interesting hook for the board game is that instead of just playing mechanical steps, you're asking the players in the game to role play and get advantages and having things happen to them in the board game because they're role playing more or better. Now, which is a really fun idea, and the question is, what is your question specifically about that?
My question is there any development tricks to bring that out that, because people get shy? Because the one thing I'm thinking of that I know of that people do is like there's the Flux version of like Monty Python where they make everybody sing or something.
Yeah, okay.
I mean you could, I guess I could just make it a rule that says you have to do this. But is there a better development mechanic to make it happen?
So the question really is then, are there development mechanics that can help people role play who aren't necessarily, for instance, expecting to role play because for God's sake they're playing a board game and they thought they were safe from this role playing stuff? Okay.
Yes.
First key question: is the role playing that you want to have them do connected to what's happening in the game? Is it like, are they playing roles that are specific to characters in the game? Are they bringing things out? Are the roles part of the game? The roles?
So the role in question here is that I was going to have it so that they interact with their objects. In other words, so let's say you have the Staff of Might. Well, your Staff of Might won't work as well if you don't role play with the staff.
Okay, so the answer is that you're then role playing with game objects to make them more to make them work. The first I think the weird part about it is you might be creating an audience participation and judging game in the sense that other people at the table need to go ahead and be entertained by the role playing. It's like a version of charades, except instead of trying to guess what they're doing, you're trying to give them approval for really being entertaining. And so, you know, if I'm sorry, but your staff of my impression is feeble, you know, then people, you know, it's like, so roll 1 dice. And then you might have a mechanic with people like everybody having approval dice, but only being able to give out a few of them, and then handing them over, you know, like, but I'm holding on to my approval dice because and the question mark is, then the question is it competitive role playing? I think it might be. I mean, I think if it's a board game and if it's not fully cooperative, you're going to have competitive role playing with people. 2 people are both role playing at the same time, and the other people have to hand out their approval dice. So the people who do better, you know, better role playing. Now, quick question: is that fun? I mean, the problem is that you have to put in mechanic. The development question is, not all of us are hams. And the people who are shy and don't want to be squashed by the hams among us need to have more reasons to play the game, which might mean that you end up giving them more approval dice. You know, try to find a way to handle the psychographics of people who want to be hams and the people who want to be, like that. I don't know. I'm doing design work right now. I'm not a developer.
I actually have a couple of things here. So they're going to the approval dice question. There's the game Mysteria, where you are handing out checks or X's about whether you think it's correct. That could probably be adapted fairly easily. You're also, I'm suddenly blanking on the game, Long Winter's Night. No, Winter's Tale. I knew it had winter in it, but you basically get a bunch of cards and you're storytelling as you go. And what I like about that is that it isn't based on whether or not you can tell a really good story. You are encouraged to, but you're not penalized for not doing it. And so from a development standpoint, I would have those immediate questions that Rob has of how are you balancing that for the people who are quieter or shyer, because you're going to have people who are like, well, I can't role play as well as this person, and you'll have one person who just completely runs away with it. And that's a balance problem that would take a lot of fine-tuning. And so at that point, talk to a group of friends. Ask them what they would be interested in. Maybe it's, you know, you have an initial, you're sitting around a table at a bar and you have to try and get patrons. And the person who does it best maybe starts off with one advantage, but the people who aren't, maybe a local priest takes pity on them and gives them something. So make sure that you're balanced out so that you're not penalizing the players who aren't as good at it, because otherwise you're running into a competition thing. The other thing, honestly, just call it out in the rule book. Don't force people to do it. Just say, here's how this game was designed to give you the tools to role play this. You know, your game will be enhanced by role playing this rather than you have to do this or you will lose the game. And so from a development standpoint, that's probably where I would go. Here is my expectation as the designer for how you will be playing. Here are things that will make it better, and here are some things to help that not penalize someone. So
I have a tag for that too.
Okay.
That's the designer's job. I as a developer, have blind developed a card game about an island where there was paranoia and madness, with no mechanic for paranoia or madness. I was told by early playtesters, it was great, we didn't trust each other, we were always backfighting, and I said, why did you do that? And they were like, we played with designers, we played it that way. I'm like, but there's nothing in this game that tells we play that way. It's a cooperative card game about surviving on an island. You shouldn't be horrible to each other.
Yeah.
And he was like, well, but that's the way you're supposed to play it. It's not the way the game presented itself, so that if you're expecting to create a game that's about role-playing, then put role-playing mechanics in it.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a board game or a card game or something where people are not going to start role-playing it because they're not having that expectation.
Right.
So Will responded by saying that he believes that this is not a development question, but is in fact the designer's responsibility to go ahead and make the role-playing mechanics part of the game to begin with, and had a very funny example where paranoia was missing, but people still played with it because the designer told them to. But I think you'll have to put those in as a designer. Then what James said earlier about statement of intent, when you give it to the developer, you tell the developer, I really want role-playing to matter, because the developer may be able to find more ways to make it matter. It's like that's something the developers love to hear.
This is what I want it to do.
Yeah, it's what I want it to do. But you should help them out with some mechanic to start with.
All right, and then anyone else who hasn't asked a question yet have a question? Okay, you had a secondary question?
Yeah. So you said that you could answer some video game questions.
A couple,
Okay.
mostly on the editing side.
Sure. Yeah. So being a student here, just coming out of first year, I had never heard a distinction between design and development. And when we did traditional game design as well as video game design, it didn't seem like the game design students were ever handing anything off to anyone. Like, it's like you stayed with the process the entire time, and like you were you had to work solo on traditional games. So I'm just wondering if it sounds like for the traditional games there is a more of a divide between design and developer side. Is that the same for the digital industry?
So the question,
oh yeah,
do you want to repeat it?
No, go ahead.
The question is, to what extent is a divide between design and development typical of both the tabletop industry and the digital game industry?
There's a reason I threw it back at.
Okay. All right. You want to?
Again, it's going to depend on the size of the project. Ideally, you do still want to have a good team of designers and developers, because video games, you'll run into the same issues as with tabletop, where you're blind as a designer to the flaws in your own program. And so if you have a developer who can come in and say, all right, here's where it doesn't work, that's awesome. And once you get to the bigger studios, you're definitely going to have more of a team working on things. If you're doing a solo game or a very small team, I would still put a lot of weight on having a developer who can come in and work with you as the designer to make sure that you aren't completely missing big chunks of the picture.
I believe that the digital aspect has a strange process that in a lot of cases, the people who manage to make a game design are also the coders, because coding skill is huge.
Yes.
And so if you have a vision of a game and the coding skills to pull it off, people therefore are creating their own game. Now the question mark is, do they have, so that you're asking your actual specific question, to what extent are there recognized development teams? I don't necessarily know that the gaming industry at digital uses that terminology all the time.
Right, it's different terminology.
I think yeah, and there'll be teams of people working whose responsibility it is to go ahead and shape the gameplay. It isn't always the case, though, that it's as recognized as a process. There are different places, I think, in different companies where it would come as a surprise to people to know that maybe it's a good idea to have different people handling the design and balance. You know, that sometimes is because, but so I can't tell you. I think on a company by company basis in the digital world, things are done differently. Tabletop industry, a lot of times this is a simple factor of money. A lot of times there isn't money to develop games. That's why editors go ahead and end up doing it, or the designer ends up doing it. Ideally, there is enough money to go ahead and have a group of people working on both, but sometimes a lot of the things that we're talking about with like what is design, what is development, are in fact handled by something like the same people, just trying to wear different hats. James?
The development step is typically taken on by a publisher. A small designer will turn over a game and the publisher will do a development step internally.
Yep.
That's how freelance game design typically works. So I don't have the developers per se, but it's it's going to go through another filter when I sell it.
Right. So James is pointing out that for freelance game designers and people working on selling projects, it's usually the publisher that handles the development. And I'm in a weird place of being simultaneously the designer and a publisher, and so I end up seeing both. But it is definitely. And he's completely correct. There are not many designers. Okay, let's put it that way. James, when when a novelist wants to go ahead and sell a book to a publishing company, as a rule, they don't have it edited first.
As an industry standard, no. That is changing.
Right.
So there is actually a point that I want to note here. The geek industry as a whole has some very noticeable areas in it. You have publishing, you have tabletop, you have comics, you have video games. Every single one of those is a distinct industry where there's a point where it went from a couple of things happening to becoming an industry in and of itself. Of these things, publishing has the biggest history. It's had the longest to kind of develop these processes and systems. Tabletop is entering a point where it's starting to hit, I think we're at, how many years? It's been like 50, 60 years of actually having business of tabletop. And so things are starting to hit systems, you're starting to see patterns, starting to figure out what's working, starting to hit another generation of it now as we move into a lot more digital and indie stuff. Video games are still very, very young in the industry standards. So you still have a lot of people that got into this as hobbyists who did not ever think that it would be a business. You have people who got into it as a business when it was still a very small thing, and now you're starting to have people like yourself who are coming in from the beginning looking at this as a big career thing. So a lot of the time what you run into is that you're just starting to codify those new positions. Like video game editors, there's still a very small handful of us, and we're still having to fight really hard with a lot of publishers or studios to convince them that they need us. Like there are a lot of video game companies that don't believe that editors are a thing.
I've never heard of video game.
Yeah, and then you play a video game and the editor's just sitting there going, oh God, typo, oh God, this should have been done, oh, what, no, why? So that's something to remember as well, is that as an industry gets more solidified and it gets bigger, those smaller roles start peeling off and becoming more codified and more regular. So I think that that's the thing with the video game industry, where it's new enough that it's still starting that process of moving away from everyone does every job to people can specialize. So I think we should probably wrap up there.
We should, unless there's some question that can be burningly answered in 30 seconds.
No pressure.
Okay, yeah, I was going to actually ask sort of almost a follow-up, but I had the question earlier. Where do you see the future going for design?
I'm sorry, sir. This question is not a 30-second question. We will talk in the hallway. No. Not.
Because the question was, what is the future of tabletop design? And since that's an entirely other panel, we will answer that one in the hallway.
All right. Good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. That was good.
Thank you.